Let's hear from LaMotta then, shall we, and get his take on why the post-war golden age of Italian-American boxing bit the canvas.
That was the period when they were mostly persecuted. You had different stages. Whichever race is mostly persecuted in this country is the race that prevails in the sports, all kinds of sports. There's a period where the blacks did it, there's a period where the Italians did it, period where the Jews did it, the Puerto Ricans, Cubans. The race that's mostly persecuted in this country, in this world, is the race that predominates in boxing.
You touched on it just a couple of moments ago, but do you think this next generation of US boxers is going to be the Eastern European immigrants or the Hispanic immigrants? Which?
Yeah, it's the Hispanics that are making more of an impact at the moment because there is a huge influx of immigration from Mexico and from other Latin American countries at the moment. Yes, there are some Eastern European fighters making an impact. One is being touted as a possible opponent of David Hayes if fights against one of the Klitschkos fall through. Thomas Adamek is a Pole who's based in New Jersey, and he's building a huge fan base there, largely made up of Poles. But it's the Hispanic community that are thriving in boxing at the moment and have been for the last decade or so. And that's what's certain about what's going to happen to boxing in the States. If it has a future and if it has a prosperous future, it will be with immigrant fighters in the ring. And I mentioned to you earlier that what's being lamented in the States at the moment is the lack of decent black fighters. I mean, you know, you've got Floyd Mayweather there, and there's Androberto also at welterweight, and another one, Chad Dawson, at light heavyweight. But you can mention them in small clusters, whereas years ago there were many of them. And the great search for another great heavyweight has almost been given up because those big athletic types as youngsters will be going towards basketball or American football.
So could American boxing disappear if an immigrant community doesn't step up to the mantle that the Italian Americans did in the 40s onwards?
I think that's one of the great fears over there. And Bob Arum said to me a couple of years ago that boxing has completely lost what he called the Anglo audience, and so it has to rely on the immigrant communities. Now, at the moment, because there is such a huge following of Hispanic fighters, then the sport is still strong in pockets in the States. But it is very different in the States in that it relies on those immigrant communities, the people that LaMotta described as the persecuted, to keep filling the gyms and filling the rings. It's very different over here. If you look at, you know, the recent success stories here, Joe Calzaghe, who incidentally is the son of an Italian immigrant, yes. Ricky Hatton, Amir Khan, Carl Froch, you know, they haven't made frequent trips to Buckingham Palace, should we say, but they haven't come from the kind of destitution that LaMotta rose out of.
Is there another problem as well, I suppose, that back then you could earn a living as an amateur, that sounds daft, but you earn a living as an amateur boxer, whereas you couldn't now?
In what way do you mean?
Well, that you would get money. I mean, there were all sorts of gambling syndicates and everything. Yeah, I mean, there were ways of making money out of boxing then that you probably couldn't now.
Yeah, because, you know, the sport has been cleaned up in so many ways, and there's just not the opportunities that were there.
And other sports have surpassed them.
And because other sports, you know, if you look at the NBA and if you look at the NFL, they've got these huge programs of scouting. They can go and cherry pick the best athletes, you know, almost in a way that the East Germans did many, many years ago, although, you know, not with anything like as nefarious as means. But they will go into colleges and high schools and identify these athletes very early on. And it's also how those sports have grown that you can, like football in this country, you can play what we would describe as a fairly low grade of football and still earn a decent amount of money here. And it's the same with basketball and American football over there. And that's why it's hard to attract, particularly the bigger guys, into the rings and the gyms.
You spoke to both LaMotta and Malignaggi, and both of them said, despite fighting 60 years apart, how lonely the life of a boxer is.
And that's why you see so many boxers with huge entourages, because it is the loneliest place in sport, and they seem to find comfort and security in lots of friends and hangers-on around them in the build-up to a fight. They seem to need that. But it is interesting that as they get closer to the fight, they get more and more ratty, and they tend to want only the very closest, the nearest and dearest around them. But there's no question it's the loneliest place in sport.
And
I've heard that from so many fighters.
And they both felt like products, maybe, in different ways. Mike Costello, thank you very much for your company this evening as we've looked back on 30 years since Raging Bull was released. Let's finish where we began an hour and a half ago, shall we, with Raging Bull. One of the saddest scenes of the film is towards the end when a bloated LaMotta recites Marlon Brando's famous lines from On the Waterfront. We will leave the last words of the evening here on 5 Live Sport to Robert De Niro and Jake LaMotta himself.
It wasn't him, Charlie, it was you. You remember that night at the Garden? You came down my dressing room and you said, "Kid, this ain't your night. We're going for the price on Wilson." Remember that? This ain't your night. My night. I could have taken Wilson apart that night. So what happens? He gets a title shot outdoors in a ballpark, and what do I get? A one-way ticket to Palookaville. I was never no good after that night, Charlie. It was like a peak you reach, and then it's downhill.
It was you, Charlie. You was my brother. You should have looked out for me a little bit. You should have taken care of me just a little bit, instead of making me take them dives for the short-run money. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody, instead of a bum, which is what I am. Yes, Charlie, it was you.